force a balance between left and right criticism, Milbank really is drawing a parallel between a violent illegal war and a sex scandal. Ultimately, it's not good for anybody, Milbank says, to get into a postmodern morass where there are no such things as facts, only competing perceptions of reality. On that, anyway, we can all agree.
Thank you, Peter. You are listening to Counterspin. Counterspin is brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group Fair.
9 Death Match Series. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see how we got it.
The weekend of March 19th and 20th saw hundreds of protests around the country against the Iraq War and continuing occupation. Those protests, which mark the second anniversary of the Iraq invasion, were hardly noted in the mainstream media. But ongoing protests aren't the only facet of the Iraq debate that gets ignored. Joining us now to talk about this is Norman Solomon. He's a syndicated columnist and a FAIR associate. Norman, welcome back to Counterspin.
Thanks, good to be here again.
Now, your recent column addressed this issue of troop withdrawal from Iraq, a concept that is almost unmentionable in mainstream media discussion. Tell us what you make of this disconnect between
there's some little flowers growing in the cracks.
Discourse and actual public opinion.
Yeah,
Whoa,
the
this is a new
option
level.
of quick withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq does seem to have gone off the table this year, and it's ironic because before and after the November elections in the U.S., there was some flurry of trial balloons that I think were more plants from the administration saying that there was some kind of consideration that the troops might be brought out as quickly as possible, when apparently it's planted by the administration for their political purposes. It's worth going on the front page of the New York Times, but now that we're into the second term, the judgment of the punditocracy seems to be that it's not even worth considering, that withdrawal of the troops is just not a feasible option.
And American public opinion is one thing, but Iraqi public opinion, as you point out in your column, is another thing entirely. And you would think when public media talk of democracy, Iraqi public opinion might matter as well.
Yeah, I mean, the contradictions are so extreme that the best way for the mass media to deal with them, apparently, is to just ignore them. I mean, we basically have a situation where, according to an NBC Wall Street Journal poll taken after the Iraqi elections, 59% of the public believes, the U.S. public thinks that the United States troops should all be pulled out in the next year. You go to Iraq and you look at the polls, even the mainstream U.S. media acknowledge, well, I'm quoting Newsweek here, their January 31st edition, now every major poll shows an ever larger majority of Iraqis want the Americans to leave. So, you got to ask, well, what's the problem here? U.S. public opinion is pretty strong to at least seriously look at a pretty quick withdrawal. By all accounts, Iraqi opinion is overwhelmingly for getting the U.S. troops out. Supposedly those troops are there at the behest and on behalf of the well-being of Iraqi people, and yet we're told by many pundits and journalists, often through silence, and then when they address the topic directly, that it's just not even worth serious consideration because it ain't going to happen and shouldn't happen. I think the conclusion is that on Capitol Hill and at the White House, withdrawal of U.S. troops is simply a non-starter. The only place where it is a starter potentially is with the U.S. public, and they don't seem to matter very much.
And one of the obstacles to getting into the media debate is this idea that if you don't have politicians on board with a given policy, be it Iraq or healthcare, you can't get that footing in the press to get into that debate. In this case, there is some reduction of action.
Yeah, I think this is the case in point of the principle that when the elites are split, you have a debate. When it seems they are not, then the news media debate is very narrow. And in this case, there was a resolution introduced by Lynn Woolsey, with now 28 co-sponsors in the U.S. House, calling for a swift withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Iraq. The resolution has gotten very little publicity in the United States.
I hope y'all are satisfied.
It's only 29 people, and these are not movers and shakers. They're
taking your shield
almost all
down, boy.
from the progressive caucus,
Taking it down.
so on and so forth. But I think there's some culpability here as well.
From the hill of this guy, you want to destroy and weaponize him.
The internet powerhouse.
Oh,
has
you just
chosen to totally ignore and not in any way support the Woolsey Get Out of Iraq resolution. And the San Francisco Chronicle just a few days ago quoted Lynn Woolsey as saying that it actually would be very helpful for the resolution
Come on, low,
if
low.
MoveOn.org would actually let the members know about it and even perhaps support it. I think this is a kind of
As soon as he shot at me one time, I was dead.
Media example where
What is that he's got?
because
And
the
I'm so
sponsors
distracted.
of this resolution in Congress are not the mucky mucks that you see often on Face the Nation and Meet the Press. Their names on the resolution are not considered to be mainstream power brokers on Capitol Hill.
No thanks to me.
The resolution's been pretty much whited out of mainstream coverage.
Now, shifting to historical analogies, comparing Iraq to Vietnam is obviously very difficult, but you've pointed to several lessons from Vietnam that could perhaps guide reporters at this stage who are covering Iraq and the debate over Iraq. What parallels do you see from that time, the media coverage of Vietnam and media coverage of Iraq?
If you go back and look at the wire service copy and transcript TV broadcast during the Vietnam War, throughout the escalation, including the early 1970s, you find a lot of similar threads.
Oh, it's lovely, ladies.
That
the girls are here, and she's looking for me. Oh my God, I'm so honored.
The idea that we have
And you can tell she likes me
responsibility
when she's
today, keep
open
our
at fire,
troops
guns
there and
blazing.
help clean up the mess that perhaps inadvertently the U.S. helped to create in the first place.
That's what I
Maybe
need.
the war
And
wasn't a
don't
good
you be
idea,
pointing your
but now
finger.
we
That's
just
not
can't
polite to
because all
point.
kinds of calamities might take place. The calamities that are taking place seem to be acceptable because the U.S. is righting some kind of wrong, other people's and/or their own. And I think those themes, particularly the one about we have a responsibility and can't leave the Iraqis in the lurch, are very strong, and they permeate media coverage in the mainstream of this country, a lot of the progressive media as well.
And this Moto Jojo
Accept the wisdom of that claim.
freak.
And the net result is that given a choice of getting troops out sooner or later,
Oh, and you want to talk this
de facto
nuclear nice.
default position of
Stop.
mass media is better to take them out later when a lot more people have died as a result of their presence.
Now, in your column, you referred to a journalist who's in Baghdad now. Tell us what he's been reporting and why you think it's important to use that there are some exceptions to the rest of the coverage.
Yeah, well, there's certainly some terrific media coverage coming directly out of Iraq, and that includes some U.S. reporters who are independent,
Eva, I'm sorry.
not embedded, and they're filing for places
You had me
that
in
are
a corner,
not
girl.
mass media, but really very important outlets. One of them is David Enders. I think he's
Oh, I gotta
brave
cross. Oh, here she
American
comes.
journalist. He's been in Iraq for most of the time since the invasion.
Oh,
He's been
two
writing
girls
for
are after me
outlets
this
like
morning.
The Nation
Oh,
magazine, MotherJones.com, another internet outlet, Guerrilla Network News, GNN, sometimes for the British Daily Independent. He actually goes out
How did that happen?
into the communities in many cities and towns in Iraq. He gets firsthand experiences and interviews. He doesn't stay behind American lines or go out in kind of big
I'm
squads.
staring at you.
Taking
Making
a lot
sure that
of
my
personal
microphone's
risk
on.
at the same time.
Congratulate me
Dispatches coming
for
out
remembering
several times a week
things
that
about
really
that.
give you a
Oh, and by the
feel
way, I
for what's
think I'm getting
happening on
better.
the ground.
Yesterday I had a
Also,
cold.
I think is very
It was like the
sensitive
last
to
day of something, I think.
what he calls
Because now I
the Iraqi
got a lot to
people,
say.
which includes,
I can't remember now.
is that
I'm like that.
They want U.S. troops out.
That's
as
more
soon
my
as
normal
possible.
stuff.
He said to me that the U.S. has never provided security for
What is
the
going on
average
with this comic
Iraqi.
book, man?
It never has, and
moving
it is
too
not
slow
doing
on
so
this.
now.
Okay.
That it has not prevented a
I was
civil
getting-
war, as he put it. If anything,
I don't know what it
US
was.
has
The music, the
exacerbated
champagne,
civil war
love,
there.
hardwood floor.
That's
Next thing I
perspective
knew, I was
that doesn't
riding
come
away.
from briefings and press releases and guided tours. It's from people who actually are in
With the corn
communities
lag
in
against the
Iraq.
pitiful figure of
Norman
Shelby,
Solomon
sitting
is
in
a fair
a sauce
associate and
mouth,
syndicated
holding a
columnist.
nice
His
little
next book,
butterfly.
War Made Easy, How Presidents
Oh,
and Pundits
poor
Keep Spinners
Sheldon.
to Death, will be published in early summer by Wiley. You can read his work at www.normansolomon.com. You can read the Media Beat column every week at FAIR's website. Norman, thanks for joining us this week on Counterspin.
Thank you.
The latest round was touched off by a complaint from pundit Susan Estrich to LA Times op-ed page editor Michael Kinsley that the paper didn't print enough opinion columns by women. But the debate over mainstream media's underrepresentation of women's voices is nothing new. And it appears that the arguments haven't advanced much either. We're hearing once more that representing women could only come at the expense of men or of people of color, or that it shouldn't matter anyway. And we're hearing that there's just something about women that makes them not want to take part in the movement debate. Is it just part of the general bold march backward in this country, or is there something else going on here? And what can we do about it? We're joined now by author and columnist for The Nation, Katha Pollitt. Welcome back to Counterspin, Katha.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, sorry about the circumstances. They feel kind of familiar. You just wrote about this most recent go-round, and I hardly know where to start. I guess I'll just ask, what was your initial reaction to this current outbreak of this old conversation?
Well, yeah, old. I wrote a column about this in 1994. It was one of the first columns I wrote, and it's in my collection, Subject to Debate. And so you would just think this should all be settled, but no, because the reality is not changing. That's the problem. The conversation is old, but the facts are the same.
So what are those facts? What are we really looking at in terms of women in media?
Well, according to editor and publisher, about 25% of syndicated columnists are women. But of course, of the big ones, only Ellen Goodman is in that top 10 that has George Will, Thomas, they're mostly conservative. The women have smaller syndications. But if you look at the op-ed pages of the big newspapers, New York Times, expanding to have 8 columnists, only one pointed out as a woman, and they publish about 60% of their freelance op-eds are by women.
God, can I be
Washington
less
Post
coordinated,
has
please?
one national political woman
Just for my own personal well-being, developmentalness.
And they publish that.
I'm about to get a hard
their
lesson.
op-eds are by women, and the LA Times, where they poll class, started 16% by, or maybe 20% by women. Times has no female columnists. They have 11 columnists, including arts and entertainment, and non-arts.
Well, when we talk about the reasons for this, that's the bold reality of it. But when we talk about why, are they different reasons in media than in any other social institution in the U.S.?
Well, I think there are a little bit, because media is very subjective. Well, what is a good writer? What do you want in a writer? It's not like you go and get an MD or a PhD or a law degree. There is really no credentialing at all. It's a very subjective thing.
Well, let's talk about some of the arguments that we're hearing, unfortunately, springing out of this initial Kinsley-Estridge thing. According to Michael Kinsley himself, and this is a subsequent column he wrote, Larry Summers of Harvard is in trouble for saying there are inherent differences between men and women. But if you suggest that women ought to be represented on op-ed pages, Kinsley implies you're also saying that women have something special to offer, and so that they're different. So what's a poor guy to do,
I really am very fond of Michael Kinsley, and I think he's brilliant, and I think he's great. But I don't think he's getting the picture here. I think, first of all, if you leave aside point of view, there is the question of talent. There is the question of people who are good at this. With lively writing styles, and not to say. I think more of those people are women than are truly represented in print, in prominent places. I would say, for example, Laura Sanders, Barbara Ehrenreich, Molly Ivins could be somewhere bigger. I could have one of these
Well,
jobs.
notice me, but then he stepped out right in front of me.
There's a very long list of sort of
Had to be able to see a long
underemployed,
track.
very smart women writers. To say nothing of people that are so discouraged from not seeing any women there that it doesn't occur to them that they do this. So there's one side of it that is just a twist, passing over of talented people through their lack of being part of the old boy or the old white network. But there is another point, which is that you can say that women find certain subjects and topics and approaches more interesting than men do, without saying there's something introduced lead different lives than men. Things matter more to them that matter less to men, and vice versa. Where is it written in stone that, being obsessed with basketball is an innate human quality? It's interesting. There are some feminist websites that I look at that do a lot of news. And these are not stories that tend to get picked up and be much discussed. Stories having to do with, say, the legalization of prostitution or the pornography debate, or just today, 100 people demonstrating in front of the National Pharmacy because the pharmacist won't fulfill prescriptions for contraception. And to me, that's a big story, You're not going to see it discussed. Because to men, it's about 100 people.
So you seem to be saying there's neither a lack of columnists ready to move into the big leagues, nor is there a lack of stories that would warrant, if you will, the inclusion of more women's perspectives. Well, what about this line, also from Kinsley, and I want to get his quote right. He says, there may be, quote, a wonderfully articulate, disabled Latina lesbian conservative who is undiscovered because she is outside the comfortable old boy network, but there probably aren't two. It's not a question of effort, it's mathematics, close quote. It sort of seems to suggest that these diversity calls just can't be satisfied. We just can't please everyone who wants representation.
Well, that may be true. I don't think that hiring writers on the basis of their identity is the only consideration. But of course, he's parodying it there. I mean, there probably are things that a disabled person knows a lot about that I don't know anything about. And you don't want to say that just because you have some identity, you have a politics that goes along with it, right? Because that really isn't true. And here, if I can say one thing, what you're finding now is that they will find that one conservative, of whatever identity group we're talking about, and that's the person who's going to get the job. The best thing to be now is a black conservative or a woman conservative.
And I think, of course, people also resent this notion that on the one side you have the purportedly neutral white male, and then on the other side you have a list of qualifications that are specific to a person and that qualify or bracket them in some way.
Yeah, and I would say, for example, I don't remember what percentage of the population white men are, maybe something like 33% or something. It wouldn't bother me at all if white men were 33% of the newspaper columnists. That's still a lot of people. They still get their POV out. I think Michael Kinsley really does fall into the trap of thinking, well, we have white men and they represent the mainstream. And then we can sort of decorate around the edges like the roses on the cake with various identity groups. And these identity groups are going to be competing with each other for that little bit of space that's left over. It wouldn't occur to him, maybe, that a woman or a Latina or a black person or whatever, an Asian person, could cover the mainstream as well and in as complicated and interesting a way as a white man can do it.
Well, we're not the only ones frustrated with the kind of perennial nature of this conversation. I know that there are some forward-looking things coming out of this. What have you heard about, and what would you say to women and men who are frustrated with this kind of back to the 1950s tone of this whole thing?
Well, I read an article, it was on Alternet actually, and I'm sorry to say I forget who wrote it, some brilliant woman, who said that, there has to be what she called a fireball of attention. There has to be kind of an effort to create a critical mass of women and, friendly men who are going to move this issue forward by continuing to stick with it. If I could just give a little bit of advice, I think it really is true that there is an old boy network, but that's not the whole story. The old boy network makes it easier for men. I think that's really true. And I think that men find it easier to write in a certain way that is currently fashionable op-ed style of tedious hostility, or however you want, or droning on, however you want to describe it. It doesn't seem to me that they're doing such a hot job. But anyway, I think that it's very, very important for women to be much more persistent than they may feel comfortable being. I'm sure many men do this too, but there are enough men left over who don't do this. I think women, I hear this, that, well, I tried there. I sent something in and I got a rejection. So I just assumed they would never want me. And I think there is a lot of sort of the nursing of wounded tried or just feeling discouraged or taking no for an answer, you would not believe how persistent men can be in this arena. They will try again and again. They will pester, they will fluster, they will bother. They understand that it doesn't really matter if somebody likes you. What matters is that they eventually see that they can use your work in some way.
We've been speaking with Katha Pollitt. You can read her column Subject to Debate regularly in The Nation magazine. Thank you so much for joining us, Katha Pollitt.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by the staff and interns at the Media Watch Group FAIR based in New York. FAIR also publishes a bi-monthly magazine called Extra. For subscription information, you can call the following number, 1-800-847-3993. That's 1-800-847-3993. You can also find out more about FAIR on our website, which is www.fair.org. The show is engineered by Kelly Spivey of Mercer Media. With me is Peter Hart. I'm Janine Jackson. Thank you for listening to Counterspin.
Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, it's been a bad week for the White House. In the midst of other brewing scandals, Richard Clark, the former top Bush counterterrorism official, is charging the White House with inadequately responding to a real terror threat and taking the fight against terror off track with the war in Iraq. Columnist and fair associate Norman Solomon will join us to discuss his latest column, The Media Politics of 9/11. Also on Counterspin, an investigation at a major daily newspaper found that one of its star correspondents filed false stories. Familiar, right? But it's not the New York Times and Jason Blair. It's the
Ooh, I
story
got on
of
the
James
board.
Kelly, a star reporter at USA Today. Freelance journalist John Gorenfeld
The next few
will
weeks
join
for
us to
madness.
take a look at Kelly's
First, the
career
returners
and
find
how
me on
important
Press Doc
these
Truffles.
fabrications
Bagels.
really are. All that's coming up, but first we'll take a look
Look at all
back
these
at
guys
the week's
lining up
press.
the theater.
What kinds of statements
No, it's
will
theater.
get you in
It's not
trouble
dramatic
on public
plays.
TV?
Comedies,
Journalist Christian
musicals.
Parenti found
A Dick
out when
Tracy
he said the following
chapter.
on the PBS NewsHour on March 2nd.
Where's all the money that's going to
Sheldon.
Halliburton and Bechtel to rebuild this country? Where is it ending up? And I
States
think
left.
that is one of the most important fundamental causes of instability, is the corruption around the contracting with these Bush-connected firms in Iraq.
That was Christian Parenti speaking on the NewsHour. His comments led host Jim Lehrer to deliver a curious apology 2 nights later. Let's have a listen.
Then there were the cocktail parties where we were all great diplomats,
Those who were
scientists,
watching 2 nights
comic
ago,
book artists.
a discussion about Iraq ended up not being as balanced as is our standard practice. While unintentional, it was indeed our mistake, and we regret it.
Lehrer's
You know,
comments
the
led
yachting
host
trips, the
of
cool
NewsHour
against the
to
Caribbean
to
cinema.
apologize
Yeah,
for Parenti.
oh.
Was balance really the issue? Or was it what Parenti was saying?
Where am I?
In an email response to FAIR activists, NewsHour executive producer Les Crystal explained that, quote, "We have no quarrel with what Christian Parenti said at the end of this segment. Our concern is with the lack of another view," close quote. That wasn't what producers had told the Village Voice after the incident. At any rate, this policy seems at best inconsistently applied. Do the opinions of all guests require a balancing perspective, or just the criticisms of Bush administration policies? And more importantly, is the NewsHour equally concerned about challenging guests who misstate the facts? It wouldn't seem so. Inaccurate statements made by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld on the September 18, 2002 NewsHour passed without comment, either by Lehrer or any other guests. It remains curious that Parenti's words, which were not at odds with the facts, would be singled out for an apology, when distortions made by government officials would be ignored.
On March 20th, 1 year after the invasion of Iraq, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets in more than 60 countries to voice their opposition to the war and the continuing occupation. existence of protesters in Iraq. On March 21st, the Associated Press mentioned the protests, even an article about attacks on U.S. soldiers. The article noted that thousands of protesters marched around the world before adding this, quote, but there were no street demonstrations either for or against the war in Iraq, close quote. On March 22nd, a news brief in USA Today reiterated the message, quote, protests in U.S. cities and abroad marked the beginning of the Iraq War a year ago Friday. No demonstrations were held in Iraq, close quote. But other reports from Baghdad told a very different story. The day before the AP report, a CNN correspondent in Baghdad described several thousand Iraqis demonstrating in the streets. Thousands of Iraqis in Baghdad and hundreds of thousands around the world represent significant opposition to the officials whose messages often dominate the news. By burying and even denying the dissenters' existence, USA Today and AP silenced important voices in a major global debate.
A March 23rd story in the New York Times announced that the United States was making progress with a campaign to eradicate coca production in Colombia through the aerial spraying of herbicides. But it wasn't all good news. As the Times put it, quote, the price of progress has been high, quote. Interesting which costs the Times highlight, namely the safety of the pilots contracted to carry out the spray, whose planes are often targeted by guerrilla groups. The program has another effect, of course, and one the myths, the effect on Colombians who are on the receiving end of the spraying. Public health consequences of spraying large areas of the country have been raised by human rights groups for years. Also, the destruction of coca plants from the air can often mean the destruction of all agriculture, since spraying herbicide from high altitudes is not exactly a precise method of eradication. Colombian politicians, farmers, environmental advocates, and human rights workers have all voiced loud opposition to the spraying campaign. The Times doesn't seek out their opinions. Instead, we hear from 3 U.S. officials who have worked in counter-narcotics and 2 pilots involved in the program. That's hardly a complete picture of the dangers of the U.S.-backed efforts in Colombia.
ABC anchor John Stossel's special 2020 series, Myths, Lies, and Stupidity, attempts to debunk well-worn myths, such as cold weather causes colds. But in the second installment of Myths, on March 22nd, Stossel spread 1 or 2 myths of his own. There, buried among more benign myths, was this one. We are destroying our forests. Stossel says that's a myth. The U.S. has more forest land now than the Agriculture Department says today America has 749 million acres of forest land. In 1920, we had 735 million acres of forest. Wait a second, did you catch that? We have more forest now. Close quote.
Then there was
Stossel
a
is
nightclub.
rigging the argument.
Being a
First,
handsome
he's
couple
making
sipping a
1920
drink.
as reference point
Everyone
because it
stared.
was a low point for U.S. forest acreage. By doing so, he's able to show a tiny
Sheldon's on the
1.8%
And
increase
then
in current
there was
forest
love,
land.
but everywhere else followed by
But
the
according
haunted
to
gods
leading
of
U.S.
Sheldon.
forest historian Douglas McCleary, before European settlement, there was 1 billion acres of forest land, or 33% more forest land than there is currently. To paraphrase Stossel, did you catch that? We have much less forest now. Furthermore, Stossel is counting as forest land areas that are dedicated to tree farms, treat areas that lack ecological diversity and bear little resemblance to natural forests. Stossel tries to dodge this point by quoting economist Holly Fretwell, a so-called free market environmentalist with pro-industry affiliations, who insists that the replanted areas are reverse. That Stossel is quoting an economist on a biological issue is just one indication of how shaky his argument on forests really is.
And finally, on Friday, March 19th, the government announced that it was dropping its case against James Yee. You might remember Yee's story from last September, when the media were buzzing with the allegations that Yee, a Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo Bay detention facility, may have actually been a spy. ABC's World News Tonight led its September 21st broadcast with a report that was pretty typical at the time. Quote, a disturbing story in the U.S. military, the arrest of an army chaplain who is an Islamic convert. The Pentagon says it is now investigating whether Captain James Yee was planning to illegally aid some of the Muslim prisoners, many of them suspected al-Qaeda terrorists. Close quote. But as the case against Yee unraveled, the level of media attention paid to him dropped substantially. By the time the government dropped the charges altogether, the story was almost entirely off the media radar. San Jose Mercury News columnist L.A. Chang pointed out that when Yi was first charged, Time magazine suggested he was like a character from a spy novel. He, quote, fit the prototype almost perfectly. Quote, from the magazine's March 29th issue, Yi's release merited only a passing mention. So there was no spy novel. The case drawn up against Yi was mostly a work of fiction. The media seemed eager to help write.
Thanks, Peter. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group FAIR. FAIR also publishes a magazine called Extra. I'll be giving some fiction information for Extra later on in the show.
Don't kill me. Please don't kill me. Please. He's gonna kill me. Help.
It's been a long time since the White House has had as bad a week as the one that just passed. The news now is reporting on mounting White House scandals involving Medicare and Iraq contracts, among others. In the one area,
I said help.
Which is still pulling decently, his conduct of the so-called war on terror.
Somebody help.
In several high-profile interviews in the new book, the White House's former top county terrorism expert, Richard Clark, is charging the Bush administration reacted inadequately to the threat posed by Al-Qaeda, even after the September 11th attacks, and took the fight against terrorism off track by pursuing war against Iraq. Joining us now to talk about the changing fortunes of the White House and how they've been covered is nationally syndicated columnist and FAIR associate Norman Solomon. His latest column, The Media Politics of 9/11, can be read at the FAIR website at www.fair.org. Welcome back to Counterspin, Norman Solomon.
Hi, good to be with you again.
Norman, let's begin with your column, The Media Politics of 9/11. It's a sort of mixture of political analysis and media analysis. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, we know now for 2.5 years that 9/11
I love it when
has
they
been the
really
ultimate
make it
fallback
count.
for
You know,
George
it's
W.
like
Bush.
waiting.
Anytime he seems
Then
to
it's
be
like one
getting
shot.
into a political corner. And in the last few days, really, the wheels have come off that vehicle that really has driven him through all kinds of political difficulties. I think we tend to forget just how badly he was doing politically before September 11th, 2001.
Well, you
And
stop
I'm
it.
sure that there's something akin to a state of shock at the White House in Karl Rove's office now because their ace in the hole may be coming up as a deuce.
Give us an example of how badly he was doing before September 11th, 2001.
Well, I went and looked at the newspapers that came off the press at dawn on September 11th, 2001, and I found, for instance, a citation on a front-page story. The Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned a national survey that had just been done by the nonpartisan pollster John Zogby, who had polled independent voters, kind of the crucial swing voters. They were giving Bush a negative rating of 53%, which Zogby commented would really augur very badly for Bush's election or re-election, depending on how you look at it, in 2004. And overall, we might call a saving grace for Bush to be able to bank for 2 years now these photo ops linking him to 9/11. I think it's notable now from a media standpoint, Bush is kind of joined at the hip with 9/11. I mean, they can adjust their TV commercials in the next 7 months, but they've already scheduled their Manhattan Republican National Convention to be ending in early September. 50 years of the Republican Party history, the latest national convention, all in order to join the Bush-Cheney ticket with 9/11 in the public mind.
Now, Norman Solomon, we're looking at Richard Clark. That seems to be the name in the news this week. He obviously appeared before the September 11th Commission, the public hearings that started on March 23rd. On Nightline that night, host Chris Bury worried that the 9/11 Commission panelists were too political, too partisan. The next day's New York Times said the opposite. They were praising them for not being overtly political. What's your impression of those hearings so far and the way the media have handled them?
Well, I think that has been overall coverage that is a little schizoid, which is unusual. On the one hand, this is supposed to be a great national issue that transcends politics. On the other hand, everything going on inside the hearing room has
I
politics
noticed these
coming out
little
of
things,
its
like the
pores.
time Max drops up, they just saw cigarettes in the
journalists
school
can't
jar.
seem to
Strange
decide
cigarettes.
sometimes
Reefers.
whether politics is part of politics. And I think for anybody who has tracked the last 30 months of the Bush administration, virtually everything that has been done that refers to 9/11 has been utilized for maneuverability to give the Bush-Cheney realize you kind of got to wonder not what planet they're on, but what planet they're pretending to be on.
Norman, for months there's been significant reporting about White House faults, the false case of war, scandals relating to the Iraq contract, etc. At the same time, media often report that George Bush gets high marks for how he's dealing with terrorism. How do you think the Clark charges affect that media equation? Does Bush now lose his last strong card in his Clark case?
Well, clearly it undermines some of what the Bush has been and is now in an election year. Something that's notable from the time is that journalists are in a position to forget or bring up the president's history, and we've had a situation where meticulous reporting can really expose some of the duplicities and distortions about the day 9/11 itself. So a couple days before Clark testified, the Wall Street Journal had a really excellent front page story headline, "Government Accounts of 9/11 Reveal Gaps," by Scott Paltrow, and I think it just shredded the not only Bush account of what happened on 9/11, but also Cheney and Andrew Carter and so forth, without it being said so in so many words, are shown to have basically lied and deceived the public about the hour-by-hour accounts of that historic day. But I have to say, you know, a few hours after Richard Clark testified, you had on Larry King Live, one of the two journalistic guests was Judith Miller, who the host Larry King referred to as a, quote, terrific journalist, unquote. So here you have Judith Miller talking about whether the White House has been deceptive on a crucial issue of national security having to do with 9/11. Arguably, the deceptions from Judith Miller, sometimes on the front page of the New York Times, have seriously damaged the United States and caused many deaths, and yet she's going on CNN to evaluate the current stature of the White House in terms of harassment.
Norman, some of the substance of Clark's charges are worth a look. A couple of the arguments that he's made. Donald Rumsfeld was calling for a war on Iraq within hours of specifically left attacks. Rumsfeld thought that they should bomb Iraq because there weren't any good targets in Afghanistan. These are the things that were coming out of Clark's book and out of his media interviews. Some reporters are now treating these charges as if they're new, or at least as if they're contested ground. Clark's charges put next to counter charges from the White House. There's sort of this media habit of taking things that should have been settled by now and putting them back in contention.
Well, what's implied quite often is that if we never reported it or soon forgot or pretended that we never reported it, then it's new. And while we might be grateful that at least lost history gets retrieved, the problem is that unless there's some sort of major split among elites in Washington, and let's recall Richard Clark was part of those elite circles, then they're liable never to be brought up. And in this case, we have then the damage control operation, which of course swung into high gear to try to close the credibility gap in the media mind. Anyway, Condoleezza Rice, who refused to show up for the public hearing of this 9/11 commission, going on NBC Nightly News for a talk with Tom Brokaw that evening, and really invoked what she called a constitutional principle at stake here. Brokaw asked, why can you do these media rounds and you can't show up under oath before the commission? And Brokaw didn't exactly hold his feet to the fire whatsoever. He just kind of tossed the question out, and that was that. I think that Condoleezza Rice did her job as it was understood to be, and that is PR flacking for the White House, when that same day, March 24th, she went on Fox News Network with Sean Hannity. And, surrealism becomes, I think, rather extreme when you have her speaking with a Fox host who has published a recent book titled Deliver Us from Evil and subtitled Defeating Terrorism, Despotism, and Liberalism. And I can't think of a more clear example of how in the last 2.5 years, the Bush administration, often with direct collusion from major media players, has sought to displace any and all forces that the White House doesn't like. In this case, again, the subtitle of Hannity's book, Terrorism, Despotism, and Liberalism.
Van Holzmiddel. I haven't seen it.
National Syndicated columnist, their associate. Newsweek's column, Media Politics of 9/11, their website, www.johnford.org. Thank you for joining us in Counterspin, Norman.
Why did you do that?
A journalist at a major media outlet has been caught fabricating
I'm shooting at you.
stories. No, it's not Jason Blair of the New York Times. This time the offender is Jack Kelly, who up until very recently was a star foreign correspondent for USA Today. How important were Kelly's journalistic sins, and what are we to make of the media reaction to them? We're joined now by John Gorenfeld, who wrote about the Kelly case for Salon.com. John Gorenfeld, welcome to Counterspin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Now, Kelly's been under investigation at USA Today for a few months. They convened a panel of media veterans to look through his stories and track down his sources and so on. They found that Kelly had fabricated a number of rather important stories, interviewing people who didn't exist, for example, or falsely placing himself at the scene of important events. Which of Kelly's fabrications jumped out at you the most?
What really jumps out is one of them that I didn't quite have time to get into in my article, which was a suicide bombing that he couldn't possibly avoid, in which he claims he saw heads shooting up into the air, their eyes still blinking, which is actually a phenomenon that's been debunked scientifically. It's an art that goes back to the French Revolution. But the one that really struck me as horrifying in the way it had a life of its own and was picked up by people was this school that he visited for young people to be trained to join the jihad in Pakistan. And he claims that he met these guys who had these things to say, which sounded like dialogue from a Steven Seagal movie, something along the lines of, "Listen, American, we will get your children to go get their playgrounds." And another one unfurled a photo of the Sears Tower and said, "This one's mine." And this story was so widely circulated that even Jim Ruster brought it up while talking to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and senators earlier that week. He wanted to know what Rumsfeld thought about it. He said, I wanted to give you a chance to think about it, talk about it, how do we change the mindset? And of course, this
Van
never happened.
Holzmiddel.
No such visit by Kelly to the school.
So this child that
Go
was
Go Girls on my team.
the
Hey, Go Go
jihadist
Girl. How you
mindset
doing?
doesn't actually apparently exist. You suggest that Kelly's inventions were in some way
no.
more important than Jason Blair.
Please
Now,
don't
articles
kill
say
me.
that Kelly, quote, trafficked in
I'll do
particular
anything you say.
Tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure, I think
Help.
that Jason Blair invented waving field
Twinkle
tobacco
Mose, what are you doing all the way back there behind me?
Jessica
Like that
Lynch's
with
parents.
your missile rack,
Tobacco
Asmodeus
field. Stephen
pilot.
Glass invented computer
That
hackers.
sucks.
Right, moralists who didn't exist. But Jack Kelly invented stories of life and death importance. He invented this Jewish settler named Avi Shapiro from Brooklyn, who supposedly exposed his buddy to the They put on their yarmulkes and cold-bloodedly gunned down a Palestinian taxi with bullets. And this story on in the area of the web of people who want to find bad things about Israel, that was widely distributed. I found a Holocaust-style site. This is a courageous reporter for revealing the truth about Jews. And likewise, there are people saying that he was courageously revealing the truth of how inhuman our enemies were. People like Jonah Goldberg at National Review were writing, look, this Sears Tower bomber and his friend who wants to get our children in their playground. Look, these are proof that we're dealing with something akin to a malfunctioning robot. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something about how they weren't really human beings that we could deal with. And I think both examples are very important.
There was also an example that was kind of a scoop for Kelly, where he apparently revealed that Palestinian ambulances at the site of attacks to bring weapons.
Yes, and as far as we know, he may have been telling God's own truth. The important part is that this shows how much the world relies on Jack Kelly's eyewitness testimony for an accurate understanding of what is really happening out there, because the ramifications are this. The Palestinians claim that the Israelis don't have any reason to stop or delay Red Crescent Arab ambulances from entering areas like Ramallah. The Israelis, for their part, and they may be completely right, claim that Palestinians are hopping out, dropping off Molotov cocktails.
I just want to
from the
make sure you
ambulance,
know.
using them for drive-by shooting.
I am
And
watching you.
Jack Kelly
happens to witness this happening. And this account is cited on the Israeli embassy. There was a U.S. congressman who followed up on it. And so where Stephen Glass wrote about very trivial, cute little things, this reporter for USA Today invented stories that influence policies that affect real human beings' lives and death.
Come on, give me my coins.
Blair's transgression was fodder for all kinds of discussions about newsroom diversity and affirmative action, on and on. Kelly's case, though, has been a minor scandal by comparison. What do you think might be some of the
Come on, Van
reasons
Holzman,
for
Alan.
this?
I think
it out
that
there. You
all
know you want
throughout
to.
the build-up to the Iraq War, I think there's a growing groundswell of resentment towards the New York Times.
Ooh, now we're in
People are
overtime.
looking
Guys,
for
don't mess it
a
up.
reason to say, you know, the New York Times does not deserve to be known as a paper of record. It has some sort of liberal agenda, and we can see that in how eagerly Bill O'Reilly's been invited Jason Blair onto his show to say, look, level with us. This is really a hotbed of liberal iniquity rather than any kind of respectable, objective paper. And so, in addition to that, there were people eager to find proof that affirmative action was a destructive thing. And
Ooh, on so
you
many
had all these
levels.
people with ready-to-go targets, waiting for the New York Times to slip up so they could attack it. The day the Jason Blair story broke, the Drudge Report had a picture of the New York Times logo upside down. On the other hand, hardly anyone has reacted to Jack Kelly, who is an evangelical Christian, and the storyline isn't a prefab storyline that's there ready to go, that there's a growing danger inviting these kinds of people into the newsroom. Nobody has anything against USA Today or against Christian evangelicals, and as a result, this whole thing has been met with a collective shrug.
Tell us a little bit more about Kelly's, I guess, membership in this Evangelical Journalistic Association. I'd never heard of this until Kelly came up.
The influential blog Eschaton, run by Atrios, the anonymous blogger, some of his research is incredible. Finding this, Googling and finding out that he was on the faculty of something called the World Journalism Institute, which trains Christians to be journalists. It says on its website that it's concerned with the need to be faithful to the Christian example of accurately reporting, being a reliable eyewitness to the work of God in today's world. Jack Kelly has expressed, of course we don't know really what was going on in his mind when he invented these things, but he's expressed this almost mystical view of what his job entails, comparing his work as a journalist to the work of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Bible, and describing himself as almost called upon by God. He says, I feel God's pleasure when I write a report. And so somehow in inventing all of these things, the whole time he was managing to tout himself as somebody paying witness to the truth, as a holy calling.
Well, we've been speaking with John Gorefeld. You can read his article, Bloodthirsty Arab Vigilante Jews, at salon.com, or you can visit his own website to read it. That's www.gorenfeld.net, GORENFELD.net. John Gorenfeld, thanks for joining us this week on Counterspin.
Thank you.
And that's it for Counterspin. Staff and interns at the Media Watch Group Fair, based in New York. Fair also publishes a bi-monthly magazine called Extra. For subscription information, you can call the following toll-free number: 1-800-847-3993. That's 1-800-847-3993. Be sure to tell them you heard about Extra here on Counterspin. You can also listen to Counterspin at Fair's own website at www.fair.org. The show is engineered by Alex Noyes at Mercer Media and co-hosted by Peter Hart, myself, and Steve Randall. Thanks for listening to Counterspin.
Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Janine Jackson, here with Steve Redmond. This week on Counterspin, the FCC is on an anti-indecency
Shooting
crusade.
wildly.
It's already led to
Flailing.
broadcasters self-censoring such
Help.
controversial things as a new
Don't kill me,
infographic
please.
on Antiques Roadshow. Who's fighting back?
Man.
What happened to all those other issues of media?
Ruin me.
We were talking about just last year. Hear from author and media historian Bob
Stand
McChesney.
right there. Let me get my dying breath
Also
point.
on the show, Daniel Ellsberg's leaking of the Pentagon Papers 35 years ago exposed the U.S. government's cynicism and disregard for the human cost of the Vietnam War. Today, Daniel Ellsberg joins us to talk about two important current whistleblower stories the media are neglecting. All of that's coming up, but first, as usual, we'll take a quick look back at recent press.
After every court that heard their case ruled against Terry Schiavo's family and their efforts to reinsert their daughter's feeding tube, the family and their supporters began to call for extra determination of the Supreme Court decision. Even some in the media jumped into the fray. On Thursday, March 24th, Fox News Channel's John Gibson suggested that Florida Governor Jeb Bush should, quote, think about telling his cops to go over to Terry Schiavo's hospice, go inside, put her on a gurney, and load her into an ambulance, close quote. Little did Gibson know that that very day, Bush's administration did just that. The Miami Herald reported on March 26th that agencies answering directly to Governor Jeb Bush were headed to Schiavo's hospice to, quote, seize her and have her feeding tube reinserted, close quote. But word had gotten to the judge in the case about the administration's plans, and he had issued an order forbidding her removal and requiring local police to enforce that order. Police told the state they planned to enforce the order. The agencies backed down. It was an almost unbelievably controversial move by the Bush administration, but the story got almost no mainstream pickup outside the Herald, a few other Knight Ridder papers, and the Associated Press. New York Times columnist Paul Krugman also mentioned it, but reporters at the Times haven't, despite the fact that, as Media Matters for America pointed out, only the day before the Herald report, the Times had written
What's going on?
the importance of
I'm like,
role in
I'm
Schiavo's
hitting
case
move, but
in
my robot is not moving. So I have a forward moving
Did
down.
you hear about the huge
just happened.
pro-democracy
I don't know if my
demonstration in
keyboard-
Bahrain? According to the British wire service Reuters, tens of thousands of people took peacefully to the streets of the Persian Gulf state on March 25th.
Oh, that's working.
Marchers demanded
Is this
that their
something like
democratically
that?
elected officials be granted real powers, including the power to implement a constitution. The organizers claim that 80,000 people marched. If that's accurate, it amounts to 12% of Bahrain's population. If you didn't hear about the demonstration, you are not alone. It was hardly reported in the U.S. media. Besides a brief squib in the New York Times, most other media, including the Washington Post, failed to mention it at all. But why not? It sounds a lot like the sort of democracy is busting out all over story the U.S. media can't seem to resist in places like Lebanon. The difference is that Bahrain, ruled by the autocratic King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, is a close U.S. ally that provides a home for the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. As Bill Van Auken points out in an in-depth article on the World Socialist website, quote, Washington is not condemning this tyrant because he is a pliant and valued instrument of U.S. imperialist policy in the region, close quote. What about the media? Van Auken says, quote, there was an embarrassed silence. The events in Bahrain cannot be reported because they expose U.S. policy as a lie. Those are tough words, but it's hard to argue when one considers the media neglect of this pro-democracy demonstration compared to its voracious appetite for stories that cast the U.S.
frantic tone when he yells,
proclaimed
"Step in the
democracy
gap!"
campaign in a good light.
And finally, perhaps the most common complaint about media is that all they care about is money. But every now and
Sounds
then
up
you
to me
realize
good. I
that
could
there's
tell I'm beginning to
money
regret our
and there's
relationship.
money. The group People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals had money, $5,000 they were prepared to pay to run an ad in Billboard magazine. And Billboard was happy to take the money. But then something happened. Somewhere in between the time Billboard agreed to run the ad and the day it was slated to run, the ad was canceled. According to the March 29th New York Daily News, PETA's ad was a direct criticism of Jennifer Lopez, whose new clothing line prominently features real fur. Could it be that the magazine found PETA's money less compelling than the influence of Sony Corporation's Epic Records, which just released Lopez's new album? and the influence of Lopez and powerful publicists. The Daily News couldn't get Billboard to return their calls to explain the decision, but the publicist, Nancy Ryder, wasn't shy about declaring victory. I'm doing
Something
my
was
job,
wrong.
which is protecting my client, Ryder told the Daily News.
Thank you, Steve. You are listening to Counterspin. Counterspin is brought to you each week by the Media Watch Fair. There's a new chairman at the FCC, and Republican Kevin Martin seems to have chosen the issue of indecency as his first order of business. The agency is proposing an expansion of so-called indecency rules, increasing the amount of fines against stations, threatening repeat violators with loss of their license, and even extending the rules to cable and satellite. The New York Times ran a story about the issue on March 28th, but you'd never guess from reading it that there was any serious opposition to these FCC moves, or anyone who disagreed with the view expressed by Kevin Martin in a letter to Brent Bozell, head of the Conservative Parents Television Council, in which Martin claims that the First Amendment rights of broadcasters, quote, should be limited by good taste, close quote. Whatever can that mean? And what can progressives, defenders of free speech, who also decry much of the schlock that's on TV and radio, be doing to take part in this debate? We're joined now by telephone by University of Illinois professor, media historian, and critic Bob McChesney. Welcome back to Counterspin, Bob McChesney.
My pleasure.
Well, we've seen a lot of political grandstanding around this, about Janet Jackson's breast, about desperate housewives. It's hard sometimes to know just how seriously to take it. But are the changes that the FCC has made and that they want to make having an actual impact in your view on what's going on there?
Well, we can only go by what we hear broadcasters say, and the answer is yes. They are deeply concerned that they might get in hot water with the FCC, and that could cost them money and potentially their licenses. So I would say the answer
I think
is yes.
something was wrong with the game
Time,
in that round.
this is still
I don't know,
unclear.
just weird.
So maybe what we're seeing is some kind of anticipatory self-censorship.
I think that's really what we're looking at. It's still unclear how much of this is just pure political reality.
Well, if you read the New York Times story that was released one, you would never know that there's even congressional opposition to this indecency crusade, or that really there was anyone other than Brent Bozell who was active on these issues. I wonder if you could fill us in a little bit about who's pushing back on this. There are some folks in and outside of Congress who take issue with these FCC moves.
Well, there are a lot of people who take issue with it. In fact, I would argue that a significant percentage of the American population would take issue with it because it's quite antithetical, I think, to the values of free speech that most Americans take pretty seriously. Now, it's going up against, I think, legitimate concerns about the sort of vulgar fare that our hyper-commercial media system tends to produce. But the solution to the problem isn't censorship. The solution is to create a system where it's not so rational to produce like someone farting and going on a television show. And, I think in Congress there have been some great voices from across the spectrum that have opposed these efforts. The most notable voice by far has been that of Representative Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who really gave an extraordinarily eloquent speech opposing having broadcast censorship fines levied by the FCC, and I think touching really on the crucial points that all of us are concerned about. That if you commission a government agency to sort of monitor content and programming and levy fines when it considers something indecent, that's giving an extraordinary amount of power to a government body that any government body will entrust with this power, but this government body with a less than august history and probably
how did that happen?
What gets said on our radio television.
Yeah, I think it strikes me and a lot of others as really discomforting to even be engaging in a conversation about
Use up my deathmatch
decency,
stickers.
given how that is so often defined. I mean, as you know, I'm no more of a fan of schlock than anyone.
I was trying to become that very friendly towards other women. I must admit, I was jealous.
The same sorts of violence, and you and I know that there's so much racist, sexist, exploitative stuff that never seems to be on the table when we're talking about decency.
It's clearly not a beholder, and I think that there's other stuff that's very offensive. That just depending on the political climate, some stuff gets elevated and other stuff doesn't. And it's not inconceivable in a country like ours. When another war, we get in the middle of civil war, that anti-war opinions might be considered unacceptable, and we could have a government body going after those. That's happened many times in our history. This is just an area that we shouldn't be in. I mean, the problem is that we have a system, a media system we've built up, a radio television system, that makes it highly rational for concentrated owners to do vulgar programming. It's inexpensive to do, it's highly profitable. And then we come along to censor it, to say don't do what's rational for you to do. So rational and enlightened public policies create a media system where you don't produce so much of that, and you just naturally produce a broader range of richer, healthier fare.
Well, now a lot of folks have gotten excited about media reform work at the FCC, and they may now see that conversation turning into this kind of conversation about indecency. What is it that you think is missing from this current conversation? And I guess what I'm really asking is, for progressives who still want to be working on media reform, how do we work within this current conversation?
Well, I think we acknowledge that, vulgar fare is a problem. We don't like what's being generated. So we say, what's the cause of this fare? Then you get to the solution. And I think there's not one particular cause, but we know two factors heavily contribute to it. One is hyper-concentration. When you have highly concentrated media ownership without local ownership, it's easier for these firms to do vulgar programming and get away with it because no one's accountable, and there's less competitive pressure for them to do other stuff. What these companies that own all their cable TV channels, there's only 4 or 5 of them own most of the channels, they're trying to get people's attention, and when they're flipping to the dial. And what they've discovered is if they can just do something gross and vulgar, they're going to have more likely to keep you. It's the cheapest, easiest way to grab an audience than to develop a character and do something good. And since there's only a handful of companies that own these stations, they all basically compete at that level and race to the bottom. If we had more owners, more diversity, more local ownership, there'd be more incentive probably to produce other types of material. The other point worth noting is that commercialism is closely linked to vulgarity. The drive for profit, the drive to satisfy advertisers. I mean, it is, you don't hear about claims of vulgarity at non-commercial stations, on public stations, because there's not the same incentive to do it. So we need to organize for broader, richer media ownership and organize also to lessen commercial pressures on media content. Those two things together are a humane and democratic policy to get us where we want to be without any censorship.
And you can maintain then, in other words, a full-on anti-censorship position while still calling for systematic change.
Exactly.
Well, why don't you tell us in the minute that we have left, there's a gathering coming up. I'll give you just a little bit to talk about what's going to be happening next month in St. Louis, where this issue, along with many other things.
Yeah, there'll be 2,000 or 3,000 people gathered in St. Louis, May 13th and 15th, the Second National Conference Media Forum, the Free Press. Our first one was in November 2003 in Madison. And it's a chance for activists working in media issues, journalists, artists, policymakers, to come together, basically the entire range of people concerned about media, and discuss strategy, tactics, understanding the issues involved, cover the full range of issues involved in public broadcasting, media ownership, advertising to children, community internet access, protection for journalism, protection for freedom of speech, and freedom of press. And it's an extraordinary moment because it gives us, it's a learning opportunity, it's a political opportunity to come together and increase their political effectiveness.
We've been speaking with Bob McChesney. Bob McChesney is professor at the University of Illinois. He's also founder of the media reform group Free Press. You can follow their work online and learn about the upcoming conference. That site is www.freepress.net. Thank you very much, Bob McChesney.
My pleasure.
Carnita.
Daniel Ellsberg is one of the most important whistleblowers in American history. 35 years ago, Ellsberg leaked a secret report about the Vietnam War, later known as the Pentagon Papers, to several U.S. news outlets, and showed the U.S. government's profound cynicism towards the public and its disregard for the deaths and injuries suffered by soldiers and civilians. Criminal actions taken by the Nixon White House against Ellsberg following the paper's publication in the New York Times and elsewhere contributed to the eventual downfall of the Nixon White House. Daniel Ellsberg's work on whistleblowing can be read on his website at truthtellingproject.org. He joins us now to talk about two current whistleblower cases that have not received much media attention, especially here in the United States. Daniel Ellsberg, welcome back to Counterspin.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's begin with the case of Mordecai Beninu. Though it would be hard to learn from U.S. media, Beninu is under indictment in Israel again. Bring us up to date, if you would, on that story.
Well, for revealing back in 1986 that Israel was not only a nuclear state, which it had never revealed, but possessed a much larger one, a growing arsenal, much larger than the CIA had ever estimated. For revealing that truth to the Israeli people of the world, he was imprisoned. He was actually returned, as a matter of fact, from England, where he was when the revelation was made to London Sunday Times. The Mossad drugged him, kidnapped him aboard a ship to Israel, took him to a secret trial in Israel.
Wretched one. Oh, help! Please don't kill me. No, please. No, please. No, please. No, no, please don't kill me. Please don't kill me. Please don't kill me. Just give me a break. One more chance. I'll do anything that you say. Please, just don't kill me.
First 2 years of that, by the way, was fulfilled that full sense for telling this truth to the world, which really Israeli deserved to know from the very beginning.
Cruelty.
Revealing that deserved
Humanity.
coming out, however, he was put under restrictions.
That was just last year that he was let out.
That was last year he came out. And he was put under restrictions that he could not talk to journalists, foreign journalists,
how did that happen?
or foreigners at all, on any subject at all. And these restrictions were based on the British emergency regulations, the British mandate regulations of 1945 that preceded the very founding of the Israeli state. I mentioned
What a fool I've been. I
over
should
there,
have left.
hoping to talk to the Knesset on his case, that when we, in my country, this country, left the British Empire in our war of independence, we left the colonial regulations behind.
It was them, but I saw a far down on the street, waiting patiently, forgiving, loyal, waiting to catch the rare species of night flying moth.
The fact is that he was violating those restrictions very openly for the whole last year. He talked to journalists freely, opposing nuclear possession by any state.
Waiting for your two magnets who walk to each other.
Repeating what he had said 19 years ago, which certainly doesn't hurt Israeli security.
Two magnets drawn powerfully together with the end of the tribe.
Just as his restrictions are due to be reviewed for renewal.
Where shall I go?
He was indicted on 21 counts of having talked to various journalists, including Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, mentioned in the indictment, and a number of other journalists in England. He hasn't gotten much coverage in the U.S. aside from Pacifica, so they weren't too much in the indictment. But he's faced now with several more years in prison, going back to prison. Taught to the press a new kind of crime.
You mentioned that he was indicted for talking to the press, so there's really a special reason that journalists should be interested
What is this going on back here?
Well, I would think so. I've talked now to several journalist organizations, and I'm happy to say
these guys, they're tricky.
The International Federation of Journalists has already protested strongly to the U.S.
Welcome to my Muslim.
Journalists involves a source, and obviously
Thank you.
restricts journalists' freedom to report.
Tell us, Daniel Ellsberg, why do you take a particular interest in a case like Mordecai Beninu?
Well, I admire Beninu tremendously. I think that he's really a primary prophet of the nuclear age, and certainly the foremost whistleblower of anything having to do with nuclear matters. He's the one who really paid the price for it. But he did exactly what he should have done. I faced a similar sentence, 115 years possibly, for releasing the Pentagon Papers. But thanks to the crimes that were committed against me, and by the way, the Israeli government committed crimes against him that were very similar to what was planned for me but not carried out. There were efforts to incapacitate me totally at one point, but they were aborted in various ways. In his case, there were clear-cut crimes committed against him in Italy, where he was lured by a Mossad agent and kidnapped. And no one has been held accountable for these crimes. They haven't even figured in his sentence. In short, I feel a good deal of empathy with him. And I'm happy that I didn't suffer the fate that Nixon had in mind for me, which is pretty much what's been done to Mordecai. But I admire him a lot, and I would like his example to be known in the world and to inspire other people to do what he did.
Well, Mordecai Benoni was very close to your heart because, as I recall, the last time you were on Counterspin, you called for more whistleblowers to come out of the U.S. policy planning apparatus as well.
I've been saying that, especially for the last 3 years, as we were allied into the war in Iraq, the same way we were in Vietnam. And I'd say right now that we need whistleblowers from inside to tell us, to confirm what is being more than hinted at, which is that an aggressive war against Iran is in the works right now, both in Israel and in the U.S. It might be one or the other or together. We certainly should be hearing, I would say, just what the prospects are, what anyone imagines would be the legal basis for that. There isn't any. And give us a chance to debate that and to oppose it, I would say, before it happens.
Well, the likelihood that the war in Iraq is an illegal, aggressive war brings us along to our other whistleblower story. Daniel Ellsberg, as you point out, there's a scandal brewing in Britain, covered in the British press but ignored here, that poses a real threat to the Blair government.
It seems that in England, both the Parliament and the public and the press take seriously the question of whether their participation in the war in Iraq was legal. They're concerned about the very strong evidence testimony that it was clearly illegal and was, in the words of Elizabeth Wilmshurst, a crime of aggression. Now, Wilmshurst says that as the former top legal advisor to the British Foreign Office, in which she'd been over 27 years. She was the deputy legal advisor and, in effect, the top expert on the subject. And her opinion, given to the British government before the war started, was that without a second UN resolution authorizing the use of force against Iraq, an attack by UN members like Britain and the U.S. would be illegal and on a scale that had to be called a crime of aggression, a crime for which Nazis and Japanese generals hung, and so the Second World War. So a very serious charge, but one that doesn't seem to arouse any even interest, curiosity in this country. The very fact that the British are concerned about this has been the subject of no news stories in this country that I'm aware of at all, looking at the Google compilation. What happened was that recently her letter of resignation of March 18, 2003, just before the war, was released on Freedom of Information Act, which is a new law over there, a new possibility. And the letter was released, but with a paragraph missing, redacted, censored out. And that paragraph then was leaked to the BBC by someone, revealing that she had said in her letter of resignation that the Attorney General there, Peter Goldsmith, had changed his views on the legality of the war twice before the war started, starting from the position that it would be illegal, the position of the Foreign Office. Then, under obvious pressure, changed that to an opinion that on March 7th, that might be legal, but would be subject to legal challenge. Might be illegal without a second resolution. And that didn't
Man, I'm gonna defenestrate you. I'll show you the new meaning of defenestrate. I hate a taser.
He changed it again to simple statement that it was unconditionally legal. The statement came out in part because the chief of the general staff in Britain demanded a clear-cut affirmation that the war would be legal. Bro. Oddly enough, this general didn't want to take part in an illegal war. Very specifically, he and his successor had said that they didn't want to be in the dock beside Slobodan Milosevic for aggressive war. And of course, they have signed on to the International Criminal Court, which Bush has resisted and denounced for reasons that are now pretty clear. That court does, to the extent that it would have jurisdiction over the U.S., would have a very clear basis for calling Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and all the others into court. That could, in principle, still happen. As a matter of fact, it could happen to Blair. So, not going to happen, needless to say, but the U.S. didn't even want that question raised in Congress. And the point is, it is being raised now very much in England. Any listener could look at Google News and look up Elizabeth Wilmshurst and find hundreds of articles not one in the U.S.
This story, like the news, is getting next to no coverage here in the U.S. media. Why is it important that journalists pay special attention to sources like these, to sources?
To the extent that sources can be punished, as was attempted in my case, or Vanunu experienced here, obviously the intent of that is to close down information from people who are not authorized to give it, which is to say real news, real information. Otherwise you're left with handouts and an account of government decision-making that is simply what the government wants you to know or permits you to know. And that's not a democracy. That's basically you've got a monarchy or a dictatorship in that respect in foreign affairs. And that's pretty much what we would have if we had the total control over sources. So journalists and the public have an extreme interest in protecting the ability of people inside the government to give information without authorization. That is information that their bosses would find embarrassing because it would reveal crimes or errors or misjudgments or lies. That's mainly the kind of thing that they're above all interested in keeping secret.
Two maggots straining to touch retarded. Now we reached to a cancer.
The public needs to know in order to hold them accountable.
Get a Wally to be another so you wearing a gallop.
Democratic control over foreign policy.
We've been speaking with Daniel Ellsberg. His latest book is Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers. You can read his work on whistleblowing at the website truthtellingproject.org. Daniel Ellsberg, thanks for joining us today on Counterspin.
Thank you for the opportunity.
That's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by the staff and interns at the Media Watch Group FAIR based in New York. For more information about FAIR, you can check out our website. It's www.fair.org. The show is engineered by Alex Noyes at Mercer Media. With me is Steve Rendell. I'm Janine Jackson. Thank you for listening to Counterspin.
Oh. The heck was that?
Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell, here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, some conservative pundits have lined up to take shots at former White House counterterrorism chief Richard Clarke. That's no surprise, but should they actually be embracing Clarke's message? And is some of the Clarke coverage missing the big picture? We'll put those questions to Newsday columnist Jim Pinkerton. Also on Counterspin this week, in reporting on the battle between the White House and Richard Clarke, the media have often avoided reporting on the plentiful evidence supporting Clarke's charges. What's more, says our guest, retired CIA official Melvin Goodman, journalists are failing to report on dramatic details from the September 11th Commission information reports. Goodman will fill us in on what we're missing. Well, that's coming up, but first we'll take a look back at the week's press.
When George W. Bush appeared at the radio and television correspondents' dinner last month, he was expected to tell a few jokes. But Bush's routine included jokes about the failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Bush's slideshow of administration officials looking around the White House for weapons elicited laughter from the audience of politicians and media figures. The media seemed unprepared for the public outrage that followed. Many wondered how Bush could make light of his bogus rationale for a war that has cost thousands of lives. Some outlets defended Bush. The Los Angeles Times editorial lamented the fact that, quote, Democrats are acting like laughs should be banned from serious politics, close quote. NBC's Tim Russert explained that, quote, the exact same joke was told to me 2 weeks ago by a very rabid anti-war Democrat, close quote. Not surprisingly, Bush's strongest allies were at the Fox News channel, where the line of defense was sometimes more offensive than the remarks themselves. On March 28th, Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace said he thought Bush was funny, but noted that some military families had taken offense. Fox weekend pundit Rick Hume immediately responded with an attack on those who look for, quote, a platform to seek victim status, close quote, and their, quote, exquisitely tender feelings about things and sensibilities which are easily offended, close quote. Hume seemed to be calling the families of dead and wounded soldiers crybabies. He concluded by saying that, quote, you have to feel like saying to people, just get over it. The problem is not that someone told a joke about WMD. As the chief purveyor of the WMD falsehood, it is beyond bad taste for George W. Bush to joke about it. It's the difference between a comedian making a joke about O.J. Simpson looking for Nicole Brown Simpson's real killer and O.J. Simpson making the same joke. That's a distinction that much of the Beltway media couldn't seem to grasp.
The Bush administration has been rocked by the testimony of former counterterrorism official Richard Clarke, but what effect has Clarke had on the public? If you looked at USA Today's front page on March 30th, you saw this headline: Majority supports Bush on terrorism. Now that is technically true, but public support for Bush's handling of terrorism is at 58%, according to the USA Today CNN poll. But when you report on polls, you have to figure which numbers are most important.
Q-tip.
USA Today buried
The bunny, yep.
poll in the 12th paragraph of a 17-paragraph story. That's where they finally explained that Bush's 58% mark is, quote, the lowest since the September 11th attacks. It is down 7 percentage points from December and 28 points from its peak just after the attacks. What's more, a slight majority of the administration is covering something up about intelligence in the September 11th attacks. USA Today is not the only media outlet misreporting recent polls. A Newsweek poll...
Q-tip, what's up, man? You're standing in the open, dude. I guess I am too. I'll back out.
2/3 of Americans say that Clarke's testimony, quote, hasn't affected their view of the president, close quote. But
see, that's more sensibility in
that
this.
support for Bush, what is supposed to be his strongest issue, is slipping.
As we discussed here a few weeks ago, some analysts seem to think that when the conservatives were defeated at the ballot box in Spain after a deadly terrorist attack, it was proof that Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists had changed the outcome. The simplistic analysis, 12 New York Times foreign affairs columnist Tom Friedman took it a step further. In his March 25th column, Friedman explained that Palestinians...
Come on, Q-tip, stop shooting at me, man.
Friedman wrote that in 1996, a string of bus bombings killed 59 Israelis.
I understand.
Helping propel hardline
Let me get you going.
Suicide bombers,
miss me.
totally undermined Labor's entry to Iraq and
Ouch.
helped elect Ariel Sharon in 2001.
Turn my lens out of my nostril, please, if you don't mind.
There's just two problems with this argument. The one is excluding
Man.
violence or provocation from the Israeli side.
Mortar slag, what is it?
Precipitated the attacks he's referring
Get
to.
my weakest man. Now watch.
1996, for example, Israel assassinated a which sparked these attacks. Simply omits.
Is it Q-tip? It really is Q-tip.
Candidate Ariel Sharon's provocative visit to the Temple Mount sparked weeks of violence. Dozens of Palestinians were killed. And in fact, there were actually very few suicide bombings against Israeli tanks before that 2001 election. The website for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs lists 3.
Man. Oh, man, I'm in trouble now.
So it seems that
Q-tip behind it. Somebody need to get that guy with that dang thermolamp. Okay, somebody got it. Thank you.
When reader Saul Davis saw March 27th story in the Los Angeles Times about George W. Bush's WMD jokes,
Are we losifying behind it? I think we
saying
are.
that Bush had cried with military families at their loved ones' funerals. Davis then sent a asking for a clarification. As he put it, quote, George Bush has not cried with families at funerals for the simple reason that he hasn't attended any, right? In other words, whoever gave me that White House quote was a liar.
Carnita.
Davis received a reasonable response.
Carnita.
Quote, thanks for the
Carnita.
call and email. That was the appreciate your attention, Steve.
Pink.
Please don't kill me, please don't shoot me.
Carnita. Don't shot me.
The White House said he had cried with the families.
What should I have done better? I have to think back on it and see if I can come up with something.
Who initially stood by the quotes confused the funeral with private meetings.
Why is this thing? I'm not behind it. That's why.
Information well known to be incorrect. Bush had attended funerals of soldiers killed in Iraq. Got through the Los Angeles Times.
No.
Without being checked.
And finally, on March 28th, U.S. forces in Iraq shut down Al Hawza, a newspaper with a large Shiite Arab readership. The explanation given in the next day's New York Times was that, quote, occupation authorities accused it of printing lies that incited violence. Quote, well, that's a pretty serious charge. No one in the article had any evidence that the paper had
Anita.
One
Thank you,
source is
darling.
said to have a reputation for publishing
Maybe I'll get some of those
rumors.
dying breath
Military
coins.
sources said to have a list of false reports published by the paper. Only one example is given. The paper is said to have
Ooh, how
reported
come
that an
it's so
explosion that killed over 50 Iraqi police recruits
That's
was
Mortis
caused by
lag
an
over here,
American
thumbing his
missile
nose
by
at
a car
people.
bomb. While we've seen the implication that the explosion was not caused by a car bomb, in many other cases, the Pentagon has denied responsibility for what later turned out to be U.S. military attacks. So it's not clear why the is wild. Now, in the months leading up to the invasion of Iraq, the New York Times published many prominent stories.
You can guess the rest of my story.
From Iraqi
I'm back with my true love. Now I know where I belong.
That could arguably be described as wild. For example, the September 8th, 2002 report that, quote,
Back
all
here on the
of
public
Iraq
school
is
street
one large
corner.
storage
Back here with
facility
Rex Rock
for
selling reefers.
weapons of mass destruction.
They want to chase
Certainly
butterflies
this
on
and
the
other
live.
reports, particularly those written by Judith Miller, turned out to be false. And by convincing readers that Iraq had threatened
Yeah, it's a
weapons
night
that
goes
it
for
did
me.
not
Kids, want to buy
possess,
something? It's cheap.
the paper
Come on, fork
certainly
over your
encouraged
lunch.
violence
Come on, before the
against
teacher
that
comes.
country.
Come on, yeah.
So by the New York Times standards, we can probably say that the New York Times printed lies that incited violence. So would it be okay if the U.S. military padlocked the New York Times?
Thanks, Peter. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group Fair. Fair also publishes a magazine called Extra. I'll give subscription.
That girl was naughty.
on the show.
Selling reefers.
Former counterterrorism official Richard Clark seemed to know that the White House and some of its allies in the media would come after him after the publication of his book Against All Enemies. But should conservative pundits actually be singing Clark's
Dragonflight,
praises?
you're taking a hit.
I think so.
Sure is.
Media coverage of Richard Clark is Jim Pinkerton. He's a columnist for Newsday here in New York and a panelist on Fox News Channel's Fox News Watch. Jim Pinkerton, welcome to Counterspin.
Thank you.
Jim, you wrote in a recent column that the conservative attacks on Clark seemed a little off the mark to you, since Clark's account of what went on in the White House seems to be supported by other credible sources. Nonetheless, columnist Charles Krauthammer calls Clark a partisan perjurer. A host of other TV pundits question Clark's motivations, politics, so on and so on. What surprised you about this line of attack?
Well, the first point was that much or most, maybe even all of what Clark said in his under oath testimony was bolstered by either other witnesses or just reality itself. It's obvious we weren't ready for the 9/11 attack. Those are just helpful facts. And the second point, which I wrote in a piece for Salon.com, was true conservatism is inherently suspicious of big government and its ways. And there's nothing bigger in a government than fighting a foreign war. And all the changes to Washington, Bush administration, and America that the neoconservatives, who I really call pseudo-conservatives, have brought to the table and
Brash
brought up the
Benji.
agenda. And it's appalling to me to see conservatives who spent much of their life being suspicious of big government, presidential power, and runaway executive authority are now falling in lockstep to A, praise Bush, and B, trash Clark. I mean, and some of it is just, at a third level, just sort of unacceptable in civilized discourse. I mean, Ann Coulter, for example, wrote a piece that she tended to get inside Dick Clark's head. Condoleezza Rice is, quote, a dummy, the black chick was a dummy, who should really be better off cleaning the old executive office building wastebasket. Now that, to me, is just either tasteless or racist or both, and it certainly doesn't belong in a rational formal discussion about the issues that Clark raised in his testimony and in his book, and other people have raised as well.
Even some of these folks spoke very keenly about explicitly like the director from the White House. Dick Cheney goes on Rush Limbaugh and says, "Oh, Clark was out of the loop." Do you think that signaled to some of these pundits that the war is on?
I do. I think that, but let's face it, it works both ways. I mean, when the Clinton White House said that Bill Clinton was innocent of, terrorism, Monica Lewinsky, half pundits in Washington said, well, that must be true because Clinton said it. And same as this, if there's an embarrassing lack of critical judgment on the part of the mainstream Republican and mainstream Democratic Clinton-didical class, where they just are so obedient to authority in many instances that they lose their distinction and whatever respect they should earn as journalists or commentators, is because they're obviously, and it's not corrupt in the sense they're getting paid to do it, they just simply, as you suggest, sort of get the line and then parrot it.
Another thing you picked up on in your salon column was this coverage of Clark and his consistency. You saw a story about this in Time Magazine and the New York Times, and they're looking at some of the details of Clark's book and the retelling of events. What do you make of this stand of the reporting on Clark?
Well, I mean, Rich Lowry at National Review and then Ramesh Raksara at that time both tried to pick up little pieces of word tone and so on. As Clark was telling the same story in his book, in testimony, doesn't right now. He saw him on the Daily Show yesterday. He's everywhere. But I think that all of us, as we consider this strand of criticism, as you say, about Clark, might ask ourselves, do we say the same thing every time we tell the same story? Do we ever get a word wrong or change something and so on? I mean, it's just absurd to pick on little word choices Clark made. I mean, bearing in mind, the guy was under oath for 2.5 hours. The transcripts are online. I'm sure every observer of Clark, pro and con, is going through those transcripts looking for, things that are either right or wrong. But the big things, I note that Clark is sort of unimpeachable. And for example, it's either true or false, as he testified, that in 1996 he'd been reading about various terrorist plots,
cultivating a rock garden under government supervision at San Quintus. When Roman encounters by Tiberius O'Leary requested provincial attorney to release him temporarily. Tiberius conferred with the warden of the Roman penitentiary. Daylight robbery at the Bank of Centurion.
Basically his idea. And he might be self-promoter, he might be sort of a glory hound, he might be trying to sell books, but he also is or is not telling the truth. And if he was telling the truth, if 5 years before 9/11, there was an anti-terror official at a high place in the White House who was thinking exactly about thwarting the sort of Al-Qaeda tactics, then it's a legitimate question for people to ask, well, how come this guy wasn't running the show for the Bush people? Why did the Bush people were doing something else? The Washington Post had a story this morning that on the day of 9/11, Condoleezza Rice was scheduled to give a speech about the big national security threat to America, which was missile defense. Well, that speech obviously was never given as the 9/11 unfolded, but it just makes you wonder why people would want to nitpick Clark over little things when the big things that he said are both true from a common sense perspective, but also can be subject to additional verification by the same journalists who would rather simply try and assassinate his character.
Jim Pinkerton, finally, if you filter out a lot of the noise around Clark's story, it seems that you're left with an account from Richard Clark that doesn't seem to be at odds with what we already knew about the run-up to September 11th. That leaves some people asking why Clark is the big news. What do you think has kept him and his story in the headlines?
Well, I mean, let's face it, from a media analysis point of view, he had a brilliant campaign. I mean, there was the synergy, if you will, between Simon & Schuster, publisher of his book. I guess it's Free Press, but Free Press is a subset of Simon & Schuster. They're all connected. Everybody else, everybody today. And CBS, which is both owned by Viacom. And so Clark got a big run-up, and I think they timed it to get in advance of the hearing. So he sold 3/4 million books by now. It's quite an astonishing publicity campaign. Although, again, I don't think that the American people are so foolish that if it was just complete crap that Clark was saying, they would be responding the way they have.
We've been speaking to Jim Pinkerton from Columbus Newsday here in New York. You can read it at Shooting the Messenger at Salon.com, and you can watch him every weekend on Fox News channel, Fox News Watch. Jim Pinkerton, thanks for joining us this week on Counterspin.
Thank you.
There's lots of evidence supporting Richard Clark's charges with the White House with concerned over Al-Qaeda before September 11, 2001. George W. Bush himself admitted to journalist Bob Woodward that terrorism, quote, was not an urgent issue for me. I didn't feel a sense of urgency, close quote. And an April 1st Washington Post report revealed the canceled speech Condoleezza Rice was to have given on September 11, 2001 reports that, though it was to have outlined major threats facing the United States, the speech concentrated on missile defense and didn't mention al-Qaeda. Instead of reporting on the substance of the charges, though, many reporters have been focusing on the political battle between Clark and the White House. In this stir, our next guest...
They said they were going to supply the music at a special celebration with Bergen and FHA Mortgage. Then they pulled javelins out of the cases and forced the bank president to open the vault. They picked up all the pecuniary that were put into the instrument cases and locked the president inside the vault. He suffocated there. He's the only one who knows the combination.
How the neoconservatives are putting the world at risk. Welcome back to Counterspin.
Just then,
Hello, Steve. Good to be with you.
Ushered in the warden's office between two guards, someone was dressed in a striped toga. This is prisoner,
the September 11th Commission reports,
the most notorious safecracker in all Rome. I forgot how to read this. It's 11, right? But VCM?
Okay, the first thing is, I learned very little from the Clark book. A lot of what's in Clark, most of what's in Clark has been out there before, and certainly has been put better in the staff reporting. The staff reporting that came out the same week as the hearing was picked up only by the New York Times, and again, only in one article, no follow-up. What the staff reports show is the unwillingness of the bureaucracy, including the military and the CIA, to think creatively and aggressively about the al-Qaeda threat, even in the wake of the 98 bombings of the embassies on the Horn of Africa, when the Clinton White House realized things had to be done, things had to be done quickly, and more aggressively. So if you go into the staff report, you get a good deal of information with regard to the fact that anti-terrorism is militarily meant for force protection and then protecting American forces overseas, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Shelton, was against the use of military force, and that the CENTCOM commander, that is the commander-in-chief for the Middle East, Marine General Zinni, also wanted not to use American forces. He had this bizarre notion that you could go to countries such as Uzbekistan, look at Uzbekistan today, and recruit foreign proxies to fight in Afghanistan. When you get to the CIA, there was a real hesitancy to act on what Clinton wanted done. Clinton is convinced, according to Samuel Berger, and again this is the staff reporting, that the CIA was going to authorize the CIA to use a policy of assassination against bin Laden. The CIA itself felt it didn't have a clear direction. It never came up with a plan other than to capture bin Laden, which was an extremely ludicrous idea when you think about it, how to capture someone without the use of lethal force. And the CIA could never find this man and beg further questions as well. And as you go through the staff reporting, you see efforts by Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, and her deputy Stephen Hadley to gut the plans that were left them by the Clinton administration. The idea wasn't with the Northern Alliance, that is Massoud, who was assassinated right before 9/11, was gutted by Condi Rice. Condi Rice and George Tenet also halted the use of the Predator, which is an excellent unmanned reconnaissance vehicle, which is very important to intelligence collection. And finally, when you look at the reporting from the staff summary, here is the chairman, Thomas Keane, on record with the inadequacies of the intelligence. Now, we already know that these cells 9/11 could have been prevented.
Oh! I deserve that.
Very specific criticism.
I'm getting my weakest man. Right back.
The CIA and the FBI to think creatively about what to do with illegal use of visas by terrorists who are entering the country. Immigration policy wasn't working. The inability of the CIA to track terrorists. The inability of watch listing. That probably wasn't new, but it's the first time you specifically referred to that. And the lack of urgency generally throughout the counterterrorism community, which is exactly what Mark has said, which got him into trouble, even though his remarks were said by the deputy director of CIA in the staff reporting, and the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Shelton. So the staff reporting offers all sorts of nuggets and places to take questioning, places for further interrogation. But what the staff reports show is this is a very timid commission. They didn't go after the issue. Instead went after James Clark on the basis of his political personality and his credibility. But the fact of the matter is, there's good material out there. There's good evidence.
Honest one, I was going straight. I just pulled that last chapter about birthday presents for my twins, Billy and Jimmy.
Recommendations, and the media is missing it.
Well, also in those staff reports,
Billy
one finds
wanted a
that
Jimmy,
before
and Jimmy
pilots
wanted a Billy.
The hijacked planes on 9/11 entered and
He had
departed
45
Iraq
years left to serve your 45-year 1-month sentence. How would you like a chance at parole, Tiberius? That would be most fortuitous, soon the Templars Tempinus and Tiberius
leaned on the Saudis to go after Al-Qaeda.
Larry were standing before the Great Wall.
Melvin Goodman, on a related story, U.S. News and World Report has a short piece on April 5th resurrecting the old notion that U.S. intelligence have been made gun-shy or risk-averse by past investigation into intelligence agencies. You say this is one of a number of myths about intelligence agencies. Could you give us a brief rundown of those myths?
Sure. The gun-shy myth is probably the fact of the matter.
Just go ahead and kill me now. Just go ahead. I'm not scared of you. I'm not going to. This is a squad dropper. 90. This minigun does 90,000 points of damage. I wanted to go after, and that's the thing, you know, it's like you're like, if you ever do that, it's like,
United States Air Force intelligence transit costs
that's a tarantula guy. Please don't kill me. Guy in the Grab family. No pile. Humiliation.
They felt a lot of the intelligence was worst-case intelligence. They never bought off on the idea of nuclear capability and reconstituted nuclear capability, which is exactly why the French and the Germans, among others, were opposed to the use of military force and wanted to give the UN more time. And one thing the media could do is somewhere along the line they should acknowledge the fact that the best job of weapons inspection was done by the UN. And the lesson to be learned there was send a team of professionals into a country such as Iraq and let them do their job and don't interfere with them politically.
We've been speaking with former CIA official Melvin Goodman. He's now a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He's also co-author of Bush League Diplomacy, published by Prometheus. Thanks again for joining us on Counterspin, Melvin Goodman.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And that's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by the staff and interns at the Media Watch Group Fair, based in New York. Fair also publishes a bi-monthly magazine called Extra. For subscription information, you can call the following toll-free number, 1-800-847-3993. That's 1-800-847-3993. You can tell them you heard about Extra here on Counterspin. You can also listen to Counterspin at Fair's website at www.fair.org. The show is engineered by Alex Rose of Mercy Media and co-hosted by Peter Hart and myself, Steve Rendell. Thanks for listening to Counterspin. Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines of the mainstream news. I'm Steve Rendell, here with Peter Hart. This week on Counterspin, new memos about the Bush administration's torture and interrogation policies in Iraq have come to light. We're big news here, but you wouldn't know it by the media's indifference to the story. What is actually in these new torture documents, and why aren't journalists picking up on the story? We'll ask one who lived near the American Civil Liberties Union. Also this week, the Presidential Commission trying to look into intelligence failures in Iraq and elsewhere delivered a report placing nearly all the blame for bad information about Iraq's weapons on the CIA and the intelligence community, and none on senior Bush administration officials. We'll talk to John Potter, the National Security Archives, about the Commission's reports. All that's coming up, but first we'll look back at the week's press.
More journalists covered the Papal Death Watch than just about any event in memory, but the blanket coverage didn't always translate into accurate or informative reporting. Fox News anchor Shepard Smith managed to blow the central fact of the story when he declared Pope John Paul II
You're in trouble, Fonzie.
early. Smith allowed
You ain't not gonna make it back out.
pass though before trying to score political points. As Vanity Fair's James Wolcott pointed out, the Fox anchor immediately
That should have been
delivered a
him,
eulogy declaring the Pope a symbol for, quote, moderation and conservatism, close quote. Little mention was made on Fox or elsewhere that the Pope opposed the conservative agenda on many issues, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and on a broad variety of economic and social justice issues. Over at USA Today, Robert Bianco seemed to think the coverage, though overdone, was on the right track. That was before it turned bad, where Bianco, quote, almost immediately upon his death, John Paul's life was hijacked by commentators on both sides of the cultural divides, close quote. Bianco complained that pundits, quote, used his words to shore up their well-honed political positions, one side stressing his condemnation of the death penalty in the wars in Iraq, and the other stressing his opposition to abortion and communism, close quote. Bianco cited no evidence that leftists talking about the Pope's anti-war position were all that common in these television segments. At CNN's Larry King Live, sometimes the coverage was simply comical, as when the host asked Jim Caviezel, the actor who played Jesus in the Passion of the Christ film, to speculate quickly on the chance the Pope was in heaven. Quote, Jim, you think he's with Jesus now? We only have 30 seconds, close quote. At least Larry King waited until the Pope was dead.
The leader of the so-called Minuteman Project was frank in the April 5th edition of the Los Angeles Times, describing his project, which brought volunteers to the Jim Nice. Said, quote, this thing was a dog and pony show designed to bring in the media and get the message out. And it worked, close quote. And indeed, media did talk about Gilchrist Group, which had been claiming they'd bring 1,000 people to the Arizona border. In the end, the Los Angeles Times said it was more like 200, with roughly a 1-to-1 ratio between Minuteman volunteers and members of the press corps. The group claimed they'd helped arrest more than 100 people crossing the border illegally, though the Border Patrol didn't have anything to say about that. Saying, quote, if the press leaves tomorrow, these guys would be gone by Thursday, close quote. But even though Gilchrist himself admits that his project was less a thoughtful show of concern about border issues than for himself, some in the media are so wedded to the group's anti-immigrant message that they insisted on presenting them in their Arizona outings as newsworthy. On its April 4th program, CNN's resident reporter moved to note, quote, "You know, I can't help being struck by the fact that every day we report on what the elites are saying, and in some cases actually doing in this country, that there seems to be a lot of common sense masked along the Arizona-Mexico border these days," close quote. Reporter Bill Tucker added, quote, "Delivered in a plain, straightforward style, Lou. Not hard to understand," close quote. To which Dobb responded, "Truth usually isn't." Okay, a group admits that they put one over on the press, and some in the press say that's fine with them. Now, that's hard to understand.
Over the past few months, some pundits have taken up a story about the American Library Association and Cuba. According to their version of events, librarians in Cuba have run afoul of the Castro government, and some have been thrown in prison for distributing banned materials. Meanwhile, American librarians have sat on their hands. As U.S. News and World Report's John Leo wrote in the magazine's March 28th issue, quote, "The American Library Association declines to protest the serious mistreatment of librarians in Cuba." Close quote. He adds that, quote, "The librarian's silence has to do with the lingering romantic attachment of the American left to communism in general and Fidel Castro in particular." Close quote. Whatever you make of Leo's charge that librarians are romantically attracted to communists or Castro, it turns out it's wrong. In the April 11th issue of the magazine, the ALA's John Barry wrote a letter explaining that the group did respond to the arrests of dissidents in a January 2004 letter to Cuban and U.S. officials. And the ALA has been investigating these libraries for the past 4 years. But then U.S. News did something funny. An editor's note ran underneath Barry's letter, saying that the ALA rejected a strong anti-Cuba resolution in January of 2004, passing a milder one instead. To the average reader, the editor's note seemed more like a correction of the ALA letter than Leo's column. Remember, their columnist claimed the ALA was silent on this issue. That is simply false.
Oh my God, that point limit has been reached.
Admit that error is striking.
As the Bush administration gears up to block the return to power of the left-wing Sandinista party in Nicaragua, U.S. media are returning to the kind of distorted reporting on Nicaragua that characterized coverage during Washington's war against that country in the 1980s. The New York Times April 5th article provided a prime example of this one-sided and inaccurate media treatment. The article characterized Daniel Ortega, the Sandinista leader and former president of Nicaragua, as a revolutionary strongman, even though he was elected in 1984 with 67% of the vote, invalidating what international observers found to be free and fair. The Times writes that the Sandinista-led government of the 1980s and the U.S.-sponsored Contra rebels, quote, fought each other to a standstill until both sides agreed to elections in 1990, which Mr. Ortega lost, close quote. This ignores the 1984 election that Ortega won and wrongly suggests that the 1990 elections happened because of Contra pressure. In fact, they were held on a 6-year schedule prescribed by the Nicaraguan Constitution. Though the article's focus is on U.S. opposition to Ortega, Ortega is never quoted. The article says that he did not grant the paper an interview. And despite a reference to extensive talks with Mr. Ortega's supporters, no members of this group are quoted either. The piece does, however, repeatedly quote an anonymous senior State Department official who makes unsubstantiated charges about Ortega and the Sandinistas, to the effect that they are not a Democratic Party and are using their power to extort the country. This is odd since Times policy supposedly discourages the use of anonymous sources, especially the granting of anonymity in the Times words, quote, to people who use it as a cover for a personal or partisan attack, close quote. When an anonymous source is attacking an official enemy, however, it appears the rules do not apply.
2000
And finally, over the years, media owners and editors have come up with different explanations for the lack of left or progressive voices in the press. Those ideas are unpopular with the public, for example, or leftists just aren't as engaging or entertaining as, say, Sean Hannity. The new head of CNN, Jonathan Klein, offered another theory during an appearance on the Charlie Rose show on March 25th. Progressives aren't angry enough. When Rose asked if there could be a successful progressive version of the Fox News channel, Klein thought not, explaining that a liberal network, quote, probably couldn't reach the same sort of an audience because liberals tend to like to sample a lot of opinions. They pride themselves on that.
That's how we can meet friends.
And,
You can come on my
they don't
chat.
get too worked up about anything. And they're pretty morally relativistic, close quote. If Klein really thinks progressives don't get too worked up about anything, maybe he's been watching too much CNN.
It could be some squad dropper. Just want to nuclear now some
progressives. But outside the CNN studios, evidence would suggest that progressives get plenty worked up. Internet organizing groups like MoveOn.org, which advocates against Bush administration policy.
All right, I'm gonna end the stream.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans marched against the Iraq War, and the 2004 Republican convention in New York City provoked massive protests. The expansion of
started on Robot Studio. I'm happy to announce
as well as the success of Bush fashion documentary Fahrenheit 9/11 would also seem to suggest that there's an audience for programming from a distinctly liberal perspective. But if Klein's true to his word, you won't see anything like that on CNN.
Thanks, Peter. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group.
Because before I also here's because she was doing stuff on Free Studio Max later on in the show. And I was going, here we'll export to FBX and then we'll bring in Roblox. We buy in Roblox and she ran around and pushed stuff around. It comes in. Like if you make a bunch of geometric primitives and export it in FBX and bring it into a Roblox thing, it just gives it default collision meshes and you can run around.
But as government documents continue to advance public understanding of what happened and who called the shots,
so that kind of piqued her interest. But the other day she was building a town.
Revelations and how the story has played out in the press is Emily Whitfield. She's the media relations director for the
yesterday
National
when she got on, she built like this wall that closed around the forest with
well, first let's start with
patrolled by
the
cats,
news
and
here.
everyone
The
was
ACLU
watching cats
received
all
the
around it.
latest
And there was a
batch of
ghost that
government
was
documents
up
at the end of
above
March.
this
What were
concrete
the most important revelations here?
Well, I'd say some of the most interesting revelations we got were that the Army's own documents acknowledge evidence that soldiers use torture. And that's something that they've been
And at first it didn't load, but then we got it to load.
We
and now
also
it's
got
so I'm going to go get her started. And I'm going to turn it
that
back on as
people
soon as
were
I
being
can. Thanks for
abused
tuning
in
in.
really kind of grisly ways. One of the most interesting documents we got, which was not given